everybody. Welcome to Wednesday Wisdom. Great to connect with you. We're continuing in our series that we began last week out of Psalm 23. And so give us a few minutes. I think we'll share some things that are going to be hopeful and helpful to you today. We're here to add value to your life. I thank you for your connection and for being part of the online Metro Life Church community. Really pray that you're having a great week. So last week, I want to recap real quick. Last week, we talked about the valley of shadows and how David in Psalm 23 gives us the connection to the Lord as our shepherd. Talked about the fact that David came at that from the perspective of having been a shepherd, so he understands how shepherds do what they do, how they lead. Shepherds don't drive us, they lead us. They don't lead from behind. They don't push us. They go ahead of us. So it's following their lead. So Jesus takes us where he's already been. That's a wonderful thought to wrap our hearts and minds around, because Paul picked up on that when he said that we do not have a high priest who's incapable of being touched by the things that we feel. So your feelings really matter, and I want to spend a moment talking about how the Lord is in tune with your feelings. Now, this is very important because when you're in a valley of shadows, you're going to fear some things, and fears are always connected to feelings. Remember that. Fears are always connected to feelings. When you fear something, you feel something. You may feel anxious. You may feel tormented. You may feel uncertain. And that all ties into the fact that the valley of shadows is a place of transitions. Transition deals with external changes. Things are going on around you. But for the most part, transitions really aren't about so much what's happening around you. The valley of shadows you're moving through, the dynamics, the insinuations, the fears, the imagination, the uncertainty. But really, transition is more about the things that are going on in you. So think of it this way. Change is about what happens around you. Transition is about what's going on inside you. And so that's why last week I asked you, what soul season are you in? So tying this all together, David saying the Lord leads us as a shepherd leads. He goes ahead of us. With that, Paul then, for we don't have a high priest who's incapable of being touched. He's not disconnected from how we feel. Literally can be translated that. So what are you fearing? What are you feeling? What soul season are you in? Where is your soul? Are you in transition at this season in your life? And I ask that question because I want you to think for a moment about what's going on inside you. Because your soul you don't have a soul, as I said last week, you are a soul. And so when we go through things, we feel things. So what are you feeling right now? At this season in your life, with everything you're dealing with, what are you feeling? How do you feel? If there's upheaval that's tied to anxiety, and the anxiety comes from a sense of overwhelm. Maybe you're dealing with overwhelm. You know, when you're in a transition, when you're in a valley of shadows, you don't see clearly. Perception is a challenge. And it's just like, it's the nature of God. It's just like God, just like the Good Shepherd, to give us an instruction without giving us clarity. Sometimes God will give you a sense of peace without giving you the details. I'm sure if you've walked with Jesus for any length of time, you know what that's like. So those are all elements of transition. So let's recap for a moment and then drive this home. So a valley of shadows is a place between, last week we called it two seasons. Really, remember, it's a place between two mountain ranges, two victories, two successes from faith to faith. So when you're there, it's shadowy. You're dealing with projections, insinuations, things that seem to be, but may not necessarily be. Now, when you look at Psalm 23, David says the reason the Lord leads us through the valley of shadows is to bring us to a place of renewal, to a place of rest, to a place of recovery and refreshing. Still waters. He leads me beside still waters. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He restores my soul. So when you're being challenged by the transitions and you don't feel a sense of composure, maybe you don't feel hopeful, maybe you don't feel like you've got it all together, maybe your anxiety is rooted in the lack of clarity you have because of the challenges that you're pressing through. So what do we do to handle that place? What do we do? So obviously, faith is engaged. But let me say this too, because it's very important. You can have faith and still not feel altogether. You can have faith and still be struggling emotionally in terms of managing your soul, your emotions, your thoughts and feelings. That's the deepest core of who you are, by the way. A real transition, when God's taking you somewhere substantial, when God is moving you into a place of greater significance. And listen, my calling is to build a hopeful prophetic expectation, not only in our faith, because the Spirit of God, the Word of the Lord activates that, but in our focus. What can we do to manage our focus when we're in transition? That's what David's alluding to in the Valley of Shadows. So we take the truth that Paul says, that Jesus knows how I feel, he knows where I am, and because of that, because he can relate. Let me say this to you. Have you thought about the fact that when you're in a difficult soul season and you're either fearful or uncertain or anxious, that Jesus is intimately acquainted? He doesn't just know how you feel. He has felt what you're feeling at this season, the lack of clarity. What's the last thing? And I mentioned this, I think, recently in church, but it really bears repeating. What's the last thing Jesus said on the cross? He says, "It's finished. It is finished." That's a declaration of faith. It's a bold declaration of faith. But go right. What's the thing he felt? So Jesus' faith says it is finished. But his feelings right before that said, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Have you ever thought about that? That when Jesus was in his valley of shadows, making the transition that he was about to make. I mean, he's in the throes of, the crucifixion is the ultimate transition on a theological, big picture level in terms of the economy of God and everything God was doing for salvation, for deliverance, for humanity. And Jesus is he's in that valley of shadows where he's about to become more effective than he's ever been because his blood is paying the price, and he's about to complete his assignment and then move to the next level. So everything is about forward focus. His faith says, it's finished, it's done, I've succeeded. But his feelings were, oh my God, where are you? God, why can't I see you? Why do I feel forsaken? Why is my soul crushed and oppressed? Why am I struggling with these emotions? The reason is because you're in transition. And in transition, you can't see clearly. Your perception is skewed. And faith isn't about being clear in your perception. It's about saying, you know what? You're leading me to a place of recovery. The resurrection's 3 days later. Jesus transitioning to recovery. Let me suggest to you that when you're in the valley of shadows, you're transitioning to a place of recovery, of soul rest, of soul recovery, of God reviving you and putting some things back together. You're coming to a place of green pastures, new beginnings. At some point in this series, I'm gonna talk about that. So that's the faith set. He restores my soul. Ask yourself the question, on the third day, after Jesus' perception is skewed in his valley of shadows, and he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? That's not a lack of faith. Jesus is expressing his feelings. That is an outcry of the anxiety of what he was feeling and experiencing in the deepest part of his soul in that place of transition. When we are in places of deep transition, we feel things. We feel crushed and bruised and anxious and maybe abandoned in our souls. And the feeling doesn't cancel the faith. You keep faithing your way through in spite of the feelings, managing them, being real about them, dealing with them, knowing that the shepherd's not driving you, he's leading. He's already gone before you to the place of recovery. That's why Jesus can look at the thief who asked him for forgiveness, and he says, today you'll be with me in paradise. Think about that. Historically, Jesus died. In fact, the Gospels talk about it. Jesus died before the thief did. So Jesus has already gone before him to prepare a place. That's a place of green pastures and still waters. I don't know what transition you're in at this season in your life, but let me tell you, you're not being driven, even though the process may seem like it's driving you, and you maybe feel driven in your emotions, driven in your fears, driven in your uncertainties. Listen, that's part of the journey. It's an indication God's leveling you up. It's an indication he's moving you to a bigger mountain. God is moving you to a bigger mountain, but your feelings can't see that when you're in transition, because transition is what goes on internally when there are changes going on around us in our lives, and God's leading us. Jesus, by his Spirit, is leading us to a place of soul recovery. So what you're coming into is better than where you are right now. And I really want to let you know today that if you're struggling in your feelings, it's okay. God has got you. Jesus feels you. Now, it's funny. There's a term in contemporary vernacular that talks about when somebody understands, there's slang and say, "I feel you." That's an indication that, I understand what you're thinking. I get it. I feel you. Paul says that. We have not a high priest. We don't have a high priest who can't feel what we feel, but who indeed does feel what we feel. So take it today by faith, that your faith may be set that, hey, I'm going to be all right, but right now I'm struggling in some transitions in my life on the inside, and I got a lot of upheaval and anxiety and a lack of clarity. And what you need to hear today by faith is you need to hear, even in that place where it feels like, my God, where are you? I don't hear you. I don't feel you. I need you, and I can't find you. And God is saying, Jesus is saying through his word and by his Spirit, I feel you. I feel you. So I want to drop that on you and leave that with you today. He feels you. And the feelings and the emotions and the anxieties of the transitions that we go through, not only does he feel us, he's already led us to a place of recovery. You will reach your recovery zone. You will sleep in green pastures. You will feed at the table of new beginnings. You will experience the recovery that only he can lead you into. Be honest, be real, set boundaries, honor and invest in the human connections that you have. And don't be intimidated by the contradiction that may seem to exist between your faith and your feelings. What you believe by faith versus the deep feelings you're processing right now. Your faith will transcend the shifts and the transitions of the feelings you're in. Remember, it's what Jesus said by faith that created what he came into. It is finished. So my faith is going to set the outcome. Your feelings are real. Your feelings are a reflection of how you're processing your transition, but your feelings won't determine your outcome. The faith of your good shepherd, your high priest, who feels you, has already gone before you and created a recovery zone. You're going to get there, and I speak life to you today. Thanks for connecting. I love you. Be blessed.